So while Richard Nixon, our president in the 70s, is dealing with the war in Vietnam, he's trying to think of a way to bring it to a close. Now, Vietnamization isn't going to end up being successful, but there was one thing we kind of needed before we could start instituting that policy. Richard Nixon wanted to try to leverage the communist countries against each other. Because remember, China and the Soviet Union are playing the same game, but they're not on the same team. They're both communist countries, but they're rivals. Okay. So Richard Nixon kind of wanted to exploit this rivalry. Now he's going to institute a policy called détente, which is going to kind of ease relations between the two countries for a little bit. I'll explain more about détente in a second. But because of this policy of détente, Richard Nixon is going to become the first president to go visit China. And China's super excited about this. They're looking to be validated by the strongest democracy in the Western Hemisphere. All right. This would be like if you were doing something wrong, but your parents were okay with it, so they let you keep doing it. Well, even though we're not really for communism, we want we hate the Soviet Union more than we hate China. Okay. Now, Nixon goes to China. He spends 7 days there, and the Chinese lose their ever loving minds about this. They're super happy that Nixon made it, and they're super happy that they can build relations with the United States. So the United States starts investing in China. We start doing business with China, and things are good. Now, this is going to cause a little bit of friction with the Soviet Union. So why did Richard Nixon choose this route? Well, Richard Nixon was under intense political pressure at home. He wasn't that great with race relations, where his predecessor, Lyndon B. Johnson, signed the Civil Rights Act. Richard Nixon wasn't doing too well enforcing it. Okay. And he also is facing social pressure to put an end to the Vietnam War. Like I said, he wants to leverage the Soviet Union and China against each other. This would make it easier to put pressure on Vietnam. And if Richard Nixon could manage to get on the side of China and end the Vietnam War, he's going to look super reelectable as president. All right, he's trying to get to his second term. So once the United States and China ease relations together, the Soviet Union steps up and is like, hey, United States, we want to be a little bit better toward you too. So the easing of relations with China led to the easing of relations with the Soviet Union. Now, keep in mind, our two countries had nuclear bombs pointed at each other. Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger managed to get the Soviet Union to sign something called the Strategic Arms Limitations Treaty, or SALT. And what this did was this made it so that each side would have to reduce their nuclear stockpile. It kind of worked, but something that's going to set this whole thing back is President Nixon is going to get forced out of office by something called the Watergate scandal. So keep in mind, Richard Nixon was trying to get reelected. All right, so the Democrats and the Republicans are setting up their camps, and the Democrats had set up their camp in a place called the Watergate Hotel. So two guys are going to break into the Watergate Hotel where the Democratic National Committee are kind of doing their campaign strategies to get Nixon out of office. And they're there to steal secrets. See, these guys were working for the Republican Party on behalf of Richard Nixon. Those two guys get caught. When Richard Nixon gets confronted about these two guys robbing the Watergate Hotel on his behalf, he tries to deny it, but Richard Nixon was obsessive compulsive about recording everything he did. Now, Richard Nixon, because of this, because of his knowledge of this happening, he gets almost impeached. He doesn't get kicked out of office, but he's forced to resign. All right. Now, when Richard Nixon got forced out of office by this scandal, this kind of set all the accomplishments he had back a little bit. We're still good with China, but we were basically back to square one with the Soviet Union.